April 14th, 1944. Inside a dim, cold British workshop, a captured Panther tank looms like a stranded iron giant. Dust from the battlefield still clings to its sloped armor. Its engine is silent. Its massive tracks rest stiffly against the concrete floor, frozen in place as if the machine itself refuses to move again. On a workbench cluttered with tools and metal shavings, Dr. Harold Thompson leans over a component he has examined countless times throughout his career. The Panther's transmission, a complex assembly, meant to harness and deliver hundreds of horsepower to the tank's drive sprockets. But something in front of him is terribly wrong. A gear 7 inches across, thick, heavy, forged to withstand the brutal forces of armored warfare, lies broken, not worn down, not fatigued over time, shattered, violently, instantly. The fracture is jagged, sharp, and catastrophic in a way no engineer would expect from a part designed to survive shock loads and battlefield abuse. Thompson's expression tightens. He has seen this before, and he knows it is not an anomaly. For months, every captured Panther the British have analyzed shows the same catastrophic failure lurking inside its transmission. A hidden weakness buried beneath its formidable armor and fearsome 75mm gun. A flaw that could render one of Germany's most advanced tanks helpless without a single Allied shell ever striking it. Thompson understands the implications immediately. If the Allies can uncover the root cause of this mechanical disaster, they can turn the Panther's greatest internal weakness into a tactical advantage. Only one question remains. What caused a transmission gear in Germany's premier battle tank to fail so suddenly and so completely? The Panther did not enter the war quietly. When it first appeared on the Eastern Front, Allied crews saw it as something entirely new, a tank that looked less like an evolution of German armor and more like a sudden leap into the future. Its long, high-velocity 75mm gun could tear through Allied tanks long before they were close enough to fire back. Its sloped frontal armor seemed to shrug off incoming rounds that would have crippled other vehicles. And behind it all roared a 700-horsepower Maybach engine, promising speed and power uncharacteristic of a machine its size. On paper, everything about the Panther suggested superiority. It was designed to be the apex predator of the armored battlefield, combining firepower, protection, and mobility in a way the Allies had not yet matched. German engineers had high ambitions for this machine, and the Allies knew it. But reality is often harsher than engineering blueprints. Long before Dr. Harold Thompson examined the fractured gear lying on his workbench, intelligence teams had already begun noticing something unusual. Captured reports, abandoned tanks, and interrogations of German crewmen all hinted at a pattern that made little sense. Panthers were breaking down often not after intense combat, but before they even reached the front line. Nearly half of the Panthers deployed suffered a major transmission failure before firing their first shot. It was an astonishing statistic for a machine rooted so deeply in Germany's reputation for mechanical precision. Somewhere inside this steel giant, beneath the armor and the aesthetics, something was deeply wrong. The contradiction fascinated Allied engineers. How could a tank with such advanced firepower and armored geometry hide a mechanical flaw severe enough to cripple it under normal battlefield stress? How could a vehicle built to dominate long-range engagements be so fragile during something as mundane as a sharp turn or sudden stop? Every clue pointed inward toward the very heart of the Panther's drivetrain. When the captured tank arrived in Britain on April 14, 1944, it carried more than just German steel. It carried questions. Questions that demanded answers not only for technical curiosity, but for strategic necessity. If this mechanical weakness was not an isolated manufacturing accident, if it was systemic, the Allies could use it to reshape their tactics against one of the most dangerous tanks Germany had ever fielded. And so, in that quiet workshop, with the smell of oil and cold metal lingering in the air, the British investigation began not with the Panther's imposing gun or armor, but with the broken remnants of a single gear, one that had failed so violently it stopped an entire tank dead. A failure dramatic enough to change the way the Allies would fight. The Panther's transmission sat on the workbench like a dissected heart, heavy, complex, and strangely delicate despite its brutal purpose. Dr. Harold Thompson wiped a streak of oil from the housing and gently turned the broken gear under the workshop light. Its jagged edge sparkled with a cold, almost crystalline sheen, a telltale sign that the failure had not been gradual. It had been sudden, instantaneous. The gear itself was massive, 7 inches across and 2.5 inches thick, a slab of steel designed to endure the punishing torque of a 700-horsepower engine. In theory, a component like this should survive the entire lifespan of a tank. It should wear, it should scuff, it might even crack slowly over years of abuse, but it should not explode. Yet this one had. The fracture pattern told a story. It wasn't rounded or fatigued. It wasn't the soft, worn surface of a part that had died over time. Instead, it had the sharp, almost glass-like edges of metal that had been pushed far beyond its limits in a single moment. Thompson had seen enough failed components in his career to recognize when something didn't add up. A part this thick, this hardened, this crucial to the Panther's movement shouldn't have shattered unless something was fundamentally wrong at the metallurgical level. He leaned closer, tracing the brake line with the tip of a pencil. Under magnification, the interior revealed a subtle contrast, harder steel at the surface, softer at the core. That part wasn't surprising. This was the result of case-hardening, a standard process where the outer layer of the gear is hardened to survive wear while the inner section remains ductile enough to absorb shock. But in the Panther's gear, the case was far too deep and far too hard. Thompson conducted a Rockwell hardness test, pressing a diamond cone into the steel surface. The needle jumped to 63 HRC, well above the intended 58 to 60. That difference may seem small, but at this level of hardness, steel becomes treacherous. It doesn't bend, it doesn't deform, it simply breaks. And when he cut the gear open, the truth grew even more concerning. The hard outer layer extended nearly 4.5 millimeters into the steel, almost double the ideal depth. That meant the brittle section was thicker, heavier, and more likely to catastrophically fail under any sudden stress. A sharp maneuver, a sudden halt, a burst of torque as the driver threw the tank into reverse. Any of these common battlefield movements could send a shockwave through the drivetrain, strong enough to snap the gear like thin ice under a heavy boot. Thompson paused, processing what he had found. This wasn't just a vulnerable component. This was a mechanical time bomb. The Panther wasn't failing because it was poorly designed. It was failing because something in the German manufacturing process had gone terribly wrong, something systematic, repeated across every captured transmission, and severe enough to neutralize one of the most feared tanks Germany had produced. And if this flaw was truly present in every Panther, it meant the Allies were no longer facing an invincible predator. They were facing a giant built on a fault line. Thompson's next steps were methodical, almost surgical. A single fractured gear could be dismissed as a rare failure, an unlucky part forged incorrectly or misused in the chaos of war. But the Panther had been plagued by breakdowns across multiple fronts. The only way to expose the truth was to treat the gear not as a piece of scrap metal, but as evidence in a forensic investigation. He clamped the broken gear onto the vise and began cutting it open. Sparks scattered across the workshop floor, revealing the internal layers that would tell him whether this failure was mechanical, metallurgical, or something altogether worse. The cross-section revealed exactly what he feared. The hardened outer shell, the case-hardened layer meant to resist wear, was far thicker than it should have been. Instead of the ideal 2 to 3 millimeters, this one measured almost 4.5 millimeters. That difference wasn't trivial. It meant that nearly twice the intended volume of the gear's surface had been transformed into extremely hard, extremely brittle steel. A tank transmission is punished constantly. Torque spikes, vibration, abrupt load changes, mud, terrain shock, and the violent jolt of shifting gears under battlefield stress. A deep, unyielding, hardened layer turns all of those forces into a danger, not a defense. To confirm the suspicion, Thompson placed the sample under the Rockwell hardness tester again, double-checking the measurement. The reading refused to budge from 63 HRC, a value dangerously above the Panther's intended range. At this level, the steel behaves less like a toughened alloy and more like ceramic impenetrable in one moment, but catastrophically fragile the next. He then prepared microscopic samples, slicing thin sections of the gear and polishing them to a mirror finish. After etching them in nitric acid, he slid them under the metallurgical microscope and dialed up the magnification. What appeared in the lenses made the entire room seem colder. The hardened surface layer wasn't just over-deepened. It was composed almost entirely of untempered martensite. Martensite is the hardest phase of steel, created when metal is rapidly cooled, quenched before its internal crystal structure can adjust. In controlled amounts, with proper tempering afterward, it's incredibly useful. It's what gives cutting tools their edge and armor plates their resilience. But when left untempered, martensite becomes the most dangerous form steel can take. It is sharp, it is brittle, it fails without warning. Under the microscope, the surface glowed with a needle-like pattern, densely packed and unforgiving. Thompson recognized it instantly. This was the microstructure of steel that had been rushed through heat treatment, either quenched too aggressively or never tempered at all. That wasn't a workshop mistake. That was a production failure. One tank might suffer from it by accident. 2 tanks, maybe coincidence. But every Panther examined so far? That pointed to systemic problems. Factories forced into overdrive, workers pushed to exhaustion, furnaces running non-stop, and no time or no ability to temper the steel properly. Thompson leaned back from the microscope, exhaling slowly. The evidence was no longer a suspicion. It was fact. The Panther's gears weren't just flawed. They were designed to fail unintentionally, but inevitably because the industrial system that produced them no longer had the capacity to make them correctly. What lay before him was not a single broken tank part. It was the symptom of an entire war machine beginning to crack under its own pressure. Thompson adjusted the focus of the microscope, letting the bright reflection of etched steel fill his view. The deeper he looked, the clearer the story became. This wasn't a simple mistake or a rare manufacturing flaw. It was a metallurgical warning sign, one that should never have made it into a frontline tank. The polished sample revealed a field of fine, needle-like structures packed together so tightly that they almost shimmered. This was martensite, the hardest and most unforgiving phase in steel's microstructure. In the right conditions, it's a valuable asset. But when created in thick, uncontrolled layers, especially without proper tempering, it becomes a silent saboteur. Untempered martensite doesn't bend. It doesn't deform. It breaks. Steel in this state behaves like it's made of glass, strong on paper, but prone to violent, explosive fracture under real stress. And in the case of the Panther, that stress was everywhere. Every time the tank shifted gears, climbed an incline, braked suddenly, or pivoted in a tight turn, the transmission was hit with massive shock loads. A hardened layer this deep, almost twice the intended specification, meant the gear wasn't absorbing those shocks. It was storing them, like tension in a stretched spring. And all it took was one moment, one surge of torque, under battlefield pressure, for that spring to snap. Thompson took another sample from a different Panther gearbox, then another, 6 in total. Each one told the same story: deep case hardening, excessive surface hardness, unstable martensite, minimal or no tempering. This wasn't a one-factory problem. It wasn't a single batch problem. It wasn't sabotage by a lone worker. It was systemic. German industry, once the envy of Europe, was cracking. Factories were rushing production, cutting corners in heat treatment cycles, skipping tempering stages, or even abandoning them entirely. Furnaces were running without rest. Skilled metallurgists were gone, killed, drafted, or replaced by forced laborers who had little training and even less support. The gears looked perfect to the naked eye when they left the factories. Smooth, polished, clean. But inside, each one carried a fatal flaw waiting to activate under stress. Thompson placed the microscope slide aside and documented his findings carefully. He had spent years studying steel failures, but few were as stark or as strategically important as this. The Panther wasn't doomed because its armor was flawed. It wasn't failing because its gun was weak. It wasn't losing battles because Allied tanks were superior. It was failing because the very metal in its most critical components had been betrayed by the war Germany was fighting and losing. The mystery was no longer a mystery. It was a diagnosis. And what Thompson had uncovered was a weakness so fundamental that it had the potential to change how the Allies confronted the Panther on every front where it appeared. The question now was simple. How could this discovery be turned from an engineering truth into a battlefield advantage? By the time Thompson finished examining the sixth transmission, the workshop felt different. The silence around him wasn't just the absence of machinery, it was the weight of a realization settling over him. This flaw wasn't rare. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't even surprising anymore. It was everywhere. Every Panther gearbox the British had acquired, captured in France, abandoned in Italy, recovered on the Eastern Front, displayed the same metallurgical fingerprint, the same hardened outer shell, the same over-deepened case layer, the same brittle martensite, the same catastrophic weakness waiting to snap. Patterns like this don't come from coincidence. They come from systems breaking under pressure. Germany's war machine, once praised for precision and discipline, was no longer operating under ideal conditions. By 1944, its factories were strained beyond capacity. Skilled workers had been drafted to the front lines. Supply lines were collapsing. Experienced metallurgists and heat treatment specialists were gone, replaced by exhausted laborers or forced workers with minimal training. It wasn't just the Panther's gears that were being rushed. Everything was. Quotas were everything. Quality was secondary, and time, once an asset, had turned into the enemy. Inside Panther production facilities, furnaces never cooled. Components moved from one stage to the next without proper waiting periods. Some parts were quenched but not tempered. Others were carburized for too long, creating surfaces harder than engineering logic allowed. The Panther's transmission gears were victims of a process designed for one purpose: output, not excellence. To an engineer, this was a perfect storm for disaster. The Panther's own reputation made matters worse. High command demanded more. Factories raced to deliver. Any gear that looked acceptable on the outside, smooth teeth, consistent shape, no visible cracks, was pushed forward in the production line. No one could afford the time to check what was hiding in the microstructure. The consequence was inevitable. A fleet of tanks strengthened on the surface, but fragile at the core. Thompson noted that the flaw wasn't just mechanical, it was human. It was the result of fatigue, pressure, fear, and desperation spreading through German industry. Each over-hardened gear carried the story of a furnace worker forced to skip a step, a supervisor racing a quota, or an exhausted laborer following procedures they barely understood. A war that was supposed to be fought with machines was increasingly being lost to the limitations of the people building them. Thompson closed his notebook. The evidence now undeniable. This wasn't a fluke. This wasn't a manufacturing mishap. This was the Achilles heel of one of Germany's most advanced tanks, a weakness woven into the metal by the very system meant to empower it. And if the flaw was widespread, predictable, and unavoidable, then it wasn't just an engineering problem. It was an opportunity, a way for the Allies to fight a weapon, not by overpowering it, but by forcing it to destroy itself. Thompson's report, once completed, did not stay in the quiet of the workshop. It moved quickly, first across desks, then through command chains, until it reached the hands of a man known for understanding not just machinery, but warfare itself. Major General Percy Hobart. Hobart was no ordinary commander. He had spent years pushing for innovation in armored tactics, refusing to accept that tanks were simply moving guns. To him, they were instruments, tools that, when used creatively, could reshape a battlefield. And when he read Thompson's findings, he immediately saw the strategic value hidden within the engineering diagnosis. The Panther could be defeated not by guns, not by armor, but by physics. Thompson's analysis revealed a simple but devastating truth. The Panther's transmission didn't fail only under extreme combat. It could fail under normal combat. The brittle gears could shatter during a sudden halt, an aggressive acceleration, a rapid turn under stress, reversing under fire, or any maneuver demanding high torque dock. To an armored commander like Hobart, this wasn't a weakness, it was an opening. If a Panther's greatest vulnerability came from its own drivetrain, then the Allies didn't need to pierce its armor. They only needed to force it to move. Hobart immediately circulated a new directive to Allied tank crews. Make the Panther maneuver. Force it to turn. Force it to stop. Force it to restart. Exploit the strain it cannot endure. Allied crews didn't need to outgun the Panther, they needed to outmaneuver it. Flanking tactics that once aimed to get behind the Panther for a clean shot now carried a second purpose: to provoke the very movements that put maximum stress on the brittle transmission gears. And when these tactics reached the battlefield, the results were unmistakable. Reports from Italy began filtering back with a tone of disbelief. Crews described Panthers that had swung to respond to a flanking attack only to freeze in place. No explosion, no smoke, no fire. The tanks simply stopped moving, locked in place as if struck down by an invisible blow. Some Panther crews attempted to keep fighting, firing from a dead stop. Others abandoned their immobilized vehicles altogether, knowing they were now stationary targets. To recovery teams moving in afterward, the scene was surreal. Steel giants left intact, their transmissions dead long before their guns ever fell silent. A mechanical flaw hidden deep within hardened steel had suddenly become a tactical weapon. It didn't matter how powerful the Panther's gun was if the tank couldn't turn. It didn't matter how thick its armor was if it couldn't reposition. It didn't matter how terrifying its silhouette seemed if it was stuck in one place. A tank that could not move, could not fight, and the flaw that engineers had traced through steel microstructures and hardness readings had now manifested across real battlefields, where broken transmissions littered the terrain like silent confessions of an overextended war machine. What began as a microscopic imperfection had become a battlefield truth. Sometimes, the deadliest shot is the one you never have to fire. The deeper Allied engineers looked into the Panther's failing transmissions, the clearer it became that the flaw wasn't merely mechanical. It wasn't just forged in steel, quenching baths, furnaces, or production quotas. It was forged in the people, those who built the gears, tended the furnaces, and labored in factories that had become as brutal as the front lines themselves. Germany's war industry in 1944 was no longer the disciplined, precision-driven machine it had been at the beginning of the conflict. It was exhausted, bleeding manpower, raw materials, and time. Factories that once boasted some of Europe's most skilled metallurgists now struggled to find qualified workers. Many had been drafted into the army. Others had been killed. The experienced hands that once guided the process were gone. Into their place came forced laborers, men and women from occupied territories, prisoners of war, and conscripts with little or no training. They were thrown into workshops and steel plants where the procedures were rushed, the conditions harsh, and the demands relentless. Under such pressure, mistakes were inevitable. Case-hardening cycles were shortened because furnaces needed to process more parts than ever before. Tempering steps were skipped because no one had the time or sometimes the fuel to perform them properly. Heat treatment charts were simplified so workers with minimal training could follow them. Some workers, weary and starving, made minor errors out of fatigue. Others, fully aware of the significance of their actions, introduced subtle mistakes, deliberately small acts of sabotage that would never be noticed on the surface of a polished gear. But the metal remembered. Each neglected tempering step, each rushed quench, each improperly managed furnace cycle left microscopic weaknesses hidden beneath the gleaming steel. To an engineer, these seemed like technical oversights. To a tank crewman risking his life in a Panther, they were life or death consequences. Germany's armored divisions paid the price. Transmission failures didn't just immobilize tanks, they stranded entire crews in exposed positions. A Panther stuck on a road or hillside became a magnet for artillery, airstrikes, and incoming fire. Crews often had no choice but to abandon their vehicles, running from the hulking machines they trusted, now betrayed by the faults embedded in their very construction. Thompson understood these implications too. His report wasn't merely about gears and hardness ratings. It documented the collapse of an industrial system under wartime strain, the story of how a nation that once prided itself on engineering excellence had been forced to cut corners until the foundation of its creations turned brittle. And in those brittle gears lay a hidden human tragedy. Tanks may be made from steel, but the flaws within them often come from something far more fragile: the people under crushing pressure to build them. As Thompson closed the final pages of his analysis, he realized that the Panther's transmission failure was not just a mechanical fault, it was the physical manifestation of a war machine stretched beyond its limits, where every shortcut, every missed step, every exhausted worker left a small crack in the armor of a seemingly unstoppable force. A crack that, when magnified across hundreds of tanks, would change the course of battles. Thompson's report did not fade into obscurity after the war. It became part of a growing archive pages of observations, metallurgical cross-sections, hardness measurements, and battlefield accounts that told a story larger than any single Panther tank. These documents would go on to influence how engineers and military planners approached armored vehicle design for decades. In the years following the war, British engineers revisited Thompson's findings with the clarity that only hindsight can provide. They studied the fractured gears carefully, not as curiosities, but as warnings. Every jagged brake line, every deep layer of untempered martensite, every over-hardened tooth represented a lesson in what happens when speed outruns precision. Modern tank manufacturing would never be the same again. Heat treatment procedures grew more standardized. Tempering cycles were no longer optional, they were verified meticulously. Quality checks became stricter, batch records more detailed, and metallurgical inspections more frequent. The legacy of the Panther's failure wasn't just technical, it was cultural. Engineers learned that no matter how advanced a machine appears, no matter how terrifying its gun or how thick its armor, the smallest flaw in the wrong place can bring the entire system crashing down. A tank is only as strong as its weakest gear. A war machine is only as reliable as the factory that builds it, and a nation's war effort is only as durable as the people who sustain it. Even today, Panther transmissions preserved in museums still carry the scars of their rushed creation. Curators have learned that these gears must be handled carefully. They remain brittle, fragile pieces of wartime metallurgy that have never truly healed from the flawed processes that forged them. 80 years later, the metal still remembers the stress embedded within it. Visitors looking at these tanks often see symbols of German engineering brilliance. They see sleek lines, thick armor, and the intimidating silhouette that once haunted Allied crews. Few notice the transmission buried deep inside, or the microstructural traps beneath its polished exterior. But the engineers who study them know the truth. The Panther was a paradox, a tank that represented both the peak of German ambition and the consequences of a collapsing industrial empire. It was a machine designed to be invincible, undone not by enemy shells or superior armor, but by the rushed, exhausted, desperate processes that forged its steel. Thompson's work ensured that future generations would understand this contradiction. He proved that knowledge, quiet, careful, methodical, could be as decisive as any weapon on the battlefield. And in the end, the Panther became more than just a tank. It became a lesson, a reminder that the smallest oversight can echo across history, that engineering is as much about patience as precision, and that even the mightiest machines can fall, not from the force of an enemy, but from the flaws embedded in their own creation.